Hello YouTube. Incest is illegal in most of the world. In some places punished very harshly. Apparently in Ireland, incest is punishable by life imprisonment for men and 7 years imprisonment for women. I'm not sure why women get it relatively easy there, but still very harsh. Here in England, I believe it's 2 years in prison. Now, I want to argue for two things, closely related, but it's worth keeping a difference in mind. First, that incest should be legalised, and second, that incest is not actually a moral problem at all. It shouldn't receive any kind of social disapprobation. And to be clear, I'm specifically talking about incestuous relationships between consenting adults, so cases of, rape and child abuse, that's a separate topic. Alright, so first of all, I'll note a basic moral principle which I think should be uncontroversial. X is permissible unless good reasons can be given for showing that it's morally wrong. So in other words, for any particular action, the burden of proof is on the person who claims that it's morally wrong. Similarly, X should be legal unless good reasons can be given for outlawing it. Again, if you want to make something illegal, the burden of proof is on you. I assume there's probably not too much disagreement on these claims. The default assumption is simply that actions are morally permissible. If you hold that something is morally wrong or morally praiseworthy, then usually you have reasons for that. It'd be kind of odd to say this is morally wrong, but I have no reasons. That would be sort of an odd position. So yeah, this means that the burden of proof is on the people who argue against incest. If you think that it's morally wrong or should be outlawed, you have to provide the reasons for that. If I can show that all your reasons fail, we have to conclude that it's permissible. So with that said, let's take a look at some of the arguments against incest. First of all, genetic abnormalities. This is probably the standard argument. It's the one I see most often, I think. The basic idea here is that inbreeding vastly increases the chance of genetic defects. A child born of a relationship between a brother and sister has, I think, something like a 50% chance of physical or mental disability of some kind. This is known as inbreeding depression. So incest involves significant risks to other people, risks to the child that may be produced, and for that reason it should be criminalised. This is a hopeless argument for many reasons. First of all, sex doesn't necessarily result in children. There's no reason why people in an incestuous relationship would have children. So even if we accept this appeal to genetic defects, the most we can conclude is that inbreeding should be criminalised. You can't have a child with a family member. That doesn't mean you can't have sex with them. If people in an incestuous relationship wanted to have children, I guess we could insist that they go for some alternative method, IVF, surrogacy, adoption, whatever. There's a lot of possibilities there. So we can dismiss this argument. It's a dumb argument. I do want to mention just a couple of other problems with it though. So second, there are many other people who have inheritable diseases. There are people who are carriers of dangerous recessive genes, and yet we don't legally prevent them from breeding. In fact, if the state started preventing people from breeding on the grounds that their offspring has a higher chance of some sort of deformity, I think a lot of people would consider that to be kind of eugenics, a step down the road to Nazism. So even as an argument against inbreeding, it's not really clear that this appeal to genetic defects is successful. If we're going to be consistent, we either need to legalise inbreeding or prohibit breeding between non-incestuous couples whose offspring would have a similar chance of genetic defects. I mean, I don't know, maybe we should prevent them from breeding. It's not totally obvious to me which way to go on that, but it's worth thinking about the consequences of accepting this argument. Okay, finally, there's I think an assumption in this appeal to genetic defects. The assumption is that bringing into the world a child with genetic defects is in some way unacceptably harmful. The idea being that it's entirely justified to use the law to prevent harmful actions. So if inbreeding involves a significant risk of harm, it's justified to have legal prohibitions against inbreeding. The question is, who exactly is harmed by inbreeding? Who is harmed when a child with genetic defects is brought into the world? Well, an intuitive answer is the child is harmed. If a child has genetic defects, it has a lower quality of life than it would have if it didn't have the genetic defects. So that seems like, yeah, the child is harmed. But this answer runs up against a famous problem in ethics known as the non-identity problem, which was discussed by Derek Parfit. Let's say a child, call him Frank, has been born of inbreeding and as a result has some genetic defect that degrades his quality of life. The question is, could the parents have done anything better for Frank? Well, no. If Frank's mother had chosen to have sex with a different person, she would have had a different child. Frank simply wouldn't have existed. So for Frank, there was no alternative available. He could not have failed to have these genetic defects. So these defects don't constitute a harm. I mean, his mother could have had a child without genetic defects, but that child wouldn't have been Frank. So it seems that it's just not true to say that a child can be harmed by inbreeding. Frank hasn't been made worse off. Okay, Frank might be in as good a state as he possibly could be. The only other option would be just not existing at all. So a second answer is to take the harm of inbreeding to be harm to society. If somebody has genetic defects, I guess there will be greater costs to medical services. If they have mental problems, it's going to be more difficult to educate them. They might have to spend their lives in care, and so on. I mean, this is kind of a dodgy argument, because how far do we take it? Should we ban extreme sports that carry a high risk of injury? Should we ban fatty foods? Maybe we should lower the speed limit to 30 miles an hour. That would save hundreds, maybe thousands of lives a year. But the main difficulty with this line is, I mean, just how much harm would actually accrue to society? Bear in mind that you're not going to be dealing with a lot of these cases. The vast majority of people have very negative responses to incest, and there's some evidence that this is biologically ingrained. It certainly makes evolutionary sense that we would be disgusted by incest. And there is evidence for what's known as the Westermark effect, which is where if you're raised in the same household as somebody during the first years of your life, you'll fail to develop any sexual attraction towards them. Actually, this effect is somewhat controversial. The evidence isn't kind of totally clear-cut. But I mean, you know, look, incest is never going to become widespread. The vast majority of people don't want to have sex with their relatives. It's awkward even talking about it, you know what I mean? So, how much harm does incest cause? Even if you allowed inbreeding, how much harm would it cause? I mean, okay, so there are going to be a few more people out there with genetic abnormalities. That's not a serious strain on our resources. There are so many other things that are much more of a problem for society than this. So I think this is, you know, in so many ways this argument doesn't work. Incidentally, on this point of genetic abnormalities, it's worth noting that the serious risk of genetic abnormalities is limited to first-degree biological relatives, parents and siblings. But between first cousins, for instance, the risk is relatively minor. It only rises by about 4%. You know, it's relative to the norm. And it would be non-existent with adopted siblings and adopted children. But incest laws in most part of the world cover relations with adopted family members as well. So, to sum up, the genetic defects argument is not an argument against incest. At best, it's an argument against inbreeding. At best. And actually, I think even as an argument against inbreeding, it has some problems. Okay, another argument that often comes up is that incest threatens the integrity of the family. This is kind of a vague idea, but I think the basic thrust of this argument is that the family unit is an essential part of our society. It's very important for bringing up children that they have some sort of stable family. Now, an incestuous relationship would cause problems for the family as a whole, because it could cause all sorts of tension and upset, especially if the incestuous relationship breaks down. You know, if two people, brother and sister, are in an incestuous relationship and then it breaks down, you know, lots of tension, lots of upset for the family. That's going to cause problems. Again, this is a stupid argument. First, why would it necessarily threaten the family? I mean, I can kind of get why, say, a parent-child relationship would threaten the family. Cheating on your wife with your daughter, at best that's going to piss your wife off. That could end up causing a lot of tension. But it doesn't have to be like this. I mean, siblings. Why would a relationship between siblings necessarily have to threaten the family? The parents might not be happy with them. but that's the parents' problem. Children often disappoint their parents. I mean, again, maybe the idea is if they're in a relationship, they break up, that's gonna cause jealousies and tension, maybe. But with many families, there's loads of jealousy and tension between siblings anyway. It's hardly the end of the family if siblings don't get on. Second, the integrity of the family is simply not a legal matter. I mean, let's grant that incest does break up families. Okay, so what? Maybe that would be sad, but, what, we're going to get the law involved? We're going to send people to prison for it? That's clearly ridiculous. Third, this argument applies to so many other things. I mean, the same argument could be used, and was, in fact, used against homosexuality. When homosexuality was illegal, there were plenty of people in straight relationships who were gay. But hey, if they reveal that they're gay, it's going to break apart those families, so let's keep it illegal. And what about gay kids who have really homophobic parents? If the child reveals that he or she is gay, that could break up the family, And in lots of other ways, people have said, in fact, I think people still do say these days, especially in some of the more conservative parts of like America and so on, that homosexuality is like a threat to the family. It's ridiculous, but, that's a common argument. I mean, maybe more standardly consider inheritance. Arguments over who should inherit what can produce extremely intense rivalry. That can definitely break up families. Nevertheless, we leave it up to individuals to decide. We don't force everybody to accept a particular program of inheritance. People decide for themselves. And what about divorce? Divorce breaks up families pretty much by definition. How many people are arguing against divorce? How many people think we should, send people who divorce into jail? I mean, and compare these things to incest. Right, as I noted earlier, incest is not widespread enough to have any significant impact. If you're concerned about the integrity of families, divorce is clearly more of a threat than incest. Are we going to outlaw divorce because it threatens the family? No, we're not. So saying that incest should be illegal for this reason is totally disingenuous. It's such a bullshit argument, this one. Okay, and finally, even putting aside all these other points, let's grant that this integrity of the family stuff isn't bullshit. Well, you know what else threatens families? Sending people to prison for doing things you don't like. Sending a brother and sister to prison because they decided to bang each other. That breaks up families. So this very argument, it undermines itself. This is an argument against outlawing incest. Okay, another way of running this integrity of the family argument is, instead of looking at the family as a whole, focus on the role of each individual family member. Every family member has a particular role and particular duties with respect to the other family members, and this role would somehow be violated by engaging in a sexual relationship. Now, to be fair, I'm prepared to grant that there are certain duties family members have to each other, but from the legal point of view, the only ones we really have to enforce are things like don't neglect your children, make sure they stay fed and healthy and so on, don't abuse your wife, don't be violent. The kinds of duties we have towards everyone else in society. Beyond this, the purpose of each family member, the function of each family member, the sort of roles individual family members should have, that's up to individuals to decide. We shouldn't be sending people to prison simply for having alternative lifestyles. And it's also worth considering, how alternative would an incestuous relationship in a family actually be? I mean, okay, let's say you've got a family and the brother and sister decide to bang each other. That's certainly weird. But how does this violate the special kinds of roles and duties that siblings have towards each other? Bear in mind that within normal families, there's a great deal of variety in how siblings relate to one another. In some families, siblings get on like best friends, they never have an argument, they're always talking, they get on great. In others, they have nothing to do with one another. They don't mind each other, they just have totally different interests, and they never really see each other. In other families, siblings hate each other. Okay, maybe they love each other too, but they also hate each other, they wind each other up, always arguing, sometimes even getting violent. Now, there's nothing morally wrong with any of these relationships. Whatever the proper roles siblings have with respect to each other are, they can realise them perfectly fine in these different scenarios. So why should sexual attraction suddenly violate these roles? Finally, as with the previous versions of this argument, this also applies to many common and accepted things. Divorce, If we grant this idea that every family member has a particular role and purpose, well, if anything is going to violate what those roles and purposes should be, it's divorce. But again, nobody's calling for divorce to be outlawed. Another popular argument is that we need to outlaw incest in order to prevent abuse. The basic concern here, I think, is with the imbalance of power. Power imbalance between two people can nullify consent. Power imbalance is a pretty vague idea, but I think it's hinting at something important. One way to think about this is with slaves. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who had a sexual relationship with a slave, and many people argue that this relationship could not possibly have been consensual because of the fundamental imbalance of power between Jefferson and his slave. Even if the slave girl wanted to do it, she couldn't really give consent because, being a slave, she didn't have any other options. So, suppose you're in a room and you know that somebody has locked the doors and windows so that there's no way for you to get out. Can you freely choose to stay in the room? Well, arguably not. In order for it to be a free choice, it would have to be the case that if you wanted to leave the room, you'd be able to. So even if you're perfectly happy to stay in the room, you can't freely choose to do so. You can't give your consent to do so. And the idea is that the slave girl who was in the relationship with Jefferson was in the same position. No matter how much she wanted the relationship, she wouldn't have been able to refuse, so her consent wasn't freely given. The power imbalance between Jefferson and the slave removed the possibility of consent. Similarly, so this argument goes, incestuous relationships involve an unacceptable power imbalance. I guess this is especially going to be a concern if there's a large age gap. When you're a child, if you have a parent or if you have a sibling who's a lot older than you, they get to tell you what to do. You're dependent on them. So there's a clear power imbalance there. Now, as I've noted at the beginning, we're not talking about incest involving people under the age of consent, we're talking about adults. But I suppose the idea is that the kind of relationship you have with family members when you're a child somehow stays with you when you become an adult. Now, I think there are several problems with this argument. First, many incestuous relationships just aren't going to have this kind of power imbalance. I don't think it's very plausible with siblings who have just a few years between them, you know, a 25-year-old brother with a 28-year-old sister, or twins, you know, who were born at the same time. Where's the power imbalance there? I mean, and actually, even between parents and children, or between siblings with a large age gap, once somebody's an adult, they're an adult. The relationship you have with your parents when you're an adult is nothing like the relationship you have with them when you're a child. If it happened that the incestuous relationship began when the younger person was 10 or 11, you know, if the parents started to groom them then or whatever, well, yeah, that's obviously wrong. But again, that's beside the point. Somebody who's 25, they can make their own decisions about who they want to have sex with. I really don't think there's, you know, even between a 25-year-old and, say, their 50-year-old parent, I don't think there's going to be much of a power imbalance there. So, second, there are significant power imbalances even in many non-incestuous relationships. For example, between a poor person and a rich person, or between a smart person and a dumb person, or between a physically strong person and a physically weak person. Somebody who's very rich could easily manipulate a poorer person in very unpleasant and maybe even abusive ways, but we don't outlaw relationships between people who have different incomes. You know, in general, there's all sorts of different ways that there can be power imbalances between people in relationships, but you know, we don't ban those relationships. We don't demand that, okay, every relationship, yep, you have to be the same age, the same social class, you know, the same kind of physical strength. I mean, that would be awful if we did that. Finally, if the concern is prevention of abuse, it seems to me that a law against incest is just, at best, redundant. We already have laws covering domestic abuse. If there's a case of a brother forcing his sister to have sex with him, clearly that's awful and should certainly be illegal, but that's already covered by laws against rape and sexual assault. Having a law against incest is redundant here. In fact, actually, if anything, I think it's arguably detrimental, because you know, by outlawing all incestuous relationships, you force them all out of sight and underground, which can only make it more difficult to pinpoint the genuinely abusive ones. I mean, think about homosexual relationships. If you were living at a time when you wouldn't even be able to admit to being gay, what would you do if you were in a gay relationship that became abusive? Who would you go to? Those laws against homosexuality criminalised everybody, including possible abuse victims. Well, it's the same with these laws against incest. If two siblings decide to have an incestuous relationship, and it starts off perfectly fine and it's all consensual and everything, and then it becomes abusive, well, they've both committed a crime, so who's the victim going to go to? So if anything, these laws are detrimental. Okay, one final kind of argument we need to address, which I think is probably the worst of the bunch, but ironically the most popular. Incest is a perversion, it's deviant, it's unnatural. Okay, so what is a perversion? This is a normative claim, right? To say that something is a perversion is in many contexts to imply that it's a sexual act that's bad or wrong in some way. Now there's an immediate problem here, because if by perversion we just mean immoral sexual act, then saying incest is a perversion doesn't explain why incest is immoral. That would clearly be circular. I say, why is incest immoral? And you say, incest is a perversion. Well, if all you mean is that incest is an immoral sexual act, that's obviously a circular argument. So the proponent of this argument needs to be a bit clearer about what perversion means. So how else might we define perversion? Well, traditionally, perversion has been linked to the purpose of sex or the function of sex. And this is the religious idea that sex is for reproduction. Incest, I guess, would be perverted on this view, since inbreeding causes a build-up of genetic deformities. Clearly this is not the way that human populations are supposed to multiply. I don't think many people in the modern world would take this definition very seriously. It would entail that masturbation and contraception are perverted. Yeah, I mean, there are a few crazy fundamentalists who think that God made sex for reproduction and contraception is wrong. But I mean, come on, that's just ridiculous. I mean, that's just insane. So another idea, maybe more intuitive these days, is that perversion simply means abnormal. A perverse sexual act is just any sexual act that is statistically unusual. Not many people do it. Okay, if you want to define it this way, fine, but this makes perversion a simple descriptive matter, and it obviously has nothing to do with morality. Just look up a list of exotic sex positions or something. You'll see a bunch of sex positions that look extremely difficult and can only be performed by Olympic gymnasts. Those are pretty abnormal, but they're not morally wrong. A third idea is that a perversion is any sexual act that evinces a psychological disorder. And I think this is kind of plausible. So you could take somebody who has a shoe fetish in the technical definition of fetish. In the technical meaning, if you have a fetish for something, you simply can't become aroused if it's not there. So this would be a guy who loves shoes to the extent that it really interferes with his sex life. It gets in the way. And I think it would be plausible to say that this is a psychological problem. Now, the trouble with defining perversion in this way is that there's arguably nothing morally wrong, and there's certainly nothing legally wrong with having a psychological problem. Depression is a psychological problem. You don't lock people up who are depressed. So, if incest really is a psychological problem, that doesn't mean we should criminalise it. But the further difficulty with this definition here is that I'd simply deny that incest is a psychological problem, or that it evinces a psychological problem. I mean, why would it be a problem? In the case of the shoe fetishist, this is something that interferes with his sex life. He can't even become aroused if his partner isn't wearing the right shoes. And when, if he goes out into the world and he sees those shoes, he just becomes mad with lust. Okay, and so this is frustrating him. It's interfering with his life. It's preventing him from, doing what he wants to do. He doesn't want to be so totally obsessed with shoes. So the psychological problem here is that it's obsessional to such an extent that it interferes with his life. And we can, the same kind of thing is the case with depression, right? What's wrong with depression? Well, it gets in the way of living a fulfilling life. Because if you're depressed, then even if everything is going really well, even if you're really rich and you've achieved all your dreams and so on, you're still going to be feeling really crap. So it's, we can see how those count as psychological problems. But with incest, why would that be a psychological problem? Both partners might be perfectly satisfied. I think the main reason why incest would cause problems is because of other people's reactions to it. Okay, it's illegal, which is going to get you sent to jail. It receives massive social condemnation. You could become the social pariah. But that's what we need to change, right? We need to change people's reactions to it. There's nothing wrong, as far as I can see, with incest in itself, so I really can't see why we would consider it a psychological problem, or something that evinces a psychological problem. Some philosophers have tried to offer more sophisticated analyses of perversion. Donald Levy suggests that we can define perversion by drawing a distinction between basic and non-basic human goods. The non-basic human goods are those that are nice, that may be very important, but that are in some sense inessential. So he lists enjoying one's dinner, getting to be famous in one's profession, winning the state lottery, having children that make you proud. He gives the complete list of basic goods as life, health, control of one's bodily and psychic functions, and the capacity for knowledge and love. It's not totally clear to me what grounds this distinction. Levy says that one mark of the basic good is that it makes no sense to say that you can have too much of it. You can't have too much of a good life, too much health, too much knowledge. On the other hand, a non-basic good like chocolate or wealth or sex, well, yeah, you can arguably have too much of those. Now, there are, I think, problems here, because I think some people would say that you can have too much life, too much knowledge. And even if you disagree with that, that sort of claim isn't unintelligible. You know, if I say somebody has lived for too long, I don't think that's an unintelligible claim. And with non-basic goods, as I said, Levy himself lists getting to be famous in one's profession. Well, can you have too much of getting to be famous in one's profession? I'm not sure that really even makes sense. But you know, okay, whatever. You can see the distinction he's driving at here. Some things are essential to a fulfilling life, some things we can go without. With this distinction in mind, Levy claims that you commit a perverted sexual act if you deny either yourself or another person one of these basic human goods, where no other basic human good is obtained as a result of this, and your motive for the denial is sexual pleasure. Perversion involves denying somebody a basic human good in order for you to obtain sexual pleasure. So I suppose one of the benefits of this account of perversion is that it does explain why it's morally wrong and why it should perhaps be legally wrong. Okay, denying somebody a basic human good, where basic human goods are things like, life and health. Well, we can see that that's obviously a bad thing. But the problem now is that this just doesn't apply to incest. Sure, there may be incestuous relationships in which one partner is denied a basic human good, but that could happen with any relationship. There are plenty of abusive relationships out there. So, whether or not, if we accept this account of perversion, I think it just turns out that incest isn't perverted. Robert Gray tries to define perversion in evolutionary terms. He says, if we are able to show that there is some adaptive function or end that sexuality evolved to fulfill, we may speak of sexual activity that departs from that function as counterproductive and, in that sense, contrary to nature or unnatural. Certain things evolved in order to fulfill a particular function. The function of the heart is to pump blood. The function of the eyes is to see. Gray's idea is, well, maybe sexuality has particular functions, and if sexuality is used in a way contrary to these functions, then it's perverted. So, what's the function of sex? Well, the traditional answer, as I mentioned, is reproduction. You have sex in order to get the woman pregnant and produce more people. Any kind of sex that couldn't possibly result in pregnancy is perverted on this view. But Gray points out that there's more to reproduction than mere conception. Reproduction doesn't just involve getting the woman pregnant, it also involves bringing up children to maturity. Now with humans, we have to put quite a lot of effort into raising children. Gray says that raising healthy, well-adjusted children requires the formation and maintenance of well-organised, stable societies and the establishment and maintenance of fairly stable male-female reproductive pairs. Sexual activity is an important part of this. Sex helps to establish and maintain male and female relationships. This is one of the functions that sex in humans has evolved to fulfill. More broadly, when it comes to social stability, Gray even suggests that homosexuality might be adaptive because it reduces sexual rivalry between men. In a polygamous society, where one man gets many women, or in a society where, for whatever reason, there are far fewer women, homosexuality might promote social order and stability by reducing male competition. I'm not sure I really buy this, but you can see that Gray's account of perversion is much more restrictive than the traditional one. So on this view, is incest perverted? Well, on the one hand, an incestuous couple won't be reproducing. If they did reproduce, their child would have significant chance of serious genetic defects. So either an incestuous couple won't produce, or they will produce, but their offspring will be far less fit than normal. So in that sense, inbreeding is maladaptive for the individual from an evolutionary point of view. But as we've seen, Gray extends his account to maintaining relationships and to maintaining social stability and social order in general. We can't conclude that something is perverted just because it reduces an individual's reproductive fitness. We also have to think about, society as a whole. And I think, there's no reason why incest should threaten social stability and social order. Now, under present conditions, it might cause problems, but that's only because of the social condemnation. There's going to be a lot of tension and aggression and so on at the moment, but that's because there's so much disapprobation towards incest. If we treated incest more like homosexuality, which thankfully is largely accepted, at least where I live, there's no reason why a few incestuous relationships would threaten the stability of society. And as for sex, well, incestuous sex can fulfill the same function as sex between any other couple. It's because they romantically love each other, they have a sexual attraction, and sex is a way of expressing and maintaining this. I'll also add that I find appealing to evolutionary function quite dodgy for two reasons. First, because it's not obvious that there are intrinsic biological functions. We tend to assume, sort of uncritically, the function of the heart is to pump blood. The heart evolved to pump blood. But this appeal to function is quite questionable. There are all sorts of different interpretations of what a biological function is. Some people hold that there are no biological functions at all, that once you kind of accept natural selection and you realise that it's a matter of small changes by blind chance, mutation arises by blind chance, and then natural selection produces these kind of small changes based on that, that this kind of undermines the very idea of things having functions, of things having purposes. It would be too much of a tangent to go into this, but I'll put up a link to an article about this below. But second, and more importantly, let's grant that there are biological functions. So we can say that various parts of the body and various behaviours evolved to serve a particular function. Well, so what? That doesn't mean we can't, just because a particular body part evolved for a particular function, that doesn't mean we can't use it for other things. Humans evolved the capacity to reason, to engage in deductive arguments. Was the evolutionary function of reason and deduction to work on complex abstract mathematics? Well, probably not. I can't imagine that set theory would have been particularly useful to hunter-gatherers, but there's clearly nothing wrong with using our capacity of reason for this purpose. So I don't think that this is very persuasive, as an argument against incest. I think that in general, the problem with, the basic issue, I think, with appealing to perversion, I suspect that any definition of perversion is going to have one of two problems in this context. Either it's going to simply be descriptive, and there's going to be nothing morally wrong with being perverted, as with the definition that a perversion is just anything that's not normal, right? Okay, there's nothing morally wrong with that. Or perversion will come out as being morally wrong, but then on that definition, incest won't count as perverted, as we saw with Donald Levy's definition. So I think this final argument is probably doomed to fail. Overall, then, I don't think there are any good arguments for outlawing incest. Maybe you have some different argument, but I strongly suspect it would suffer similar problems as the arguments I've examined. Now, given the point I made at the beginning that the burden of proof is on the opponent of incest, I think we have to conclude it should be legalized. But let me just, so I think I've done, I think it should clearly be legalized. I'll just briefly mention some positive reasons for legalizing it. First of all, because these laws are simply useless. Even if there were good reasons to outlaw it, it's not at all obvious that the laws are going to do any good, because if people want to have sex with each other, they're going to have sex with each other. You have to ask, what good are these laws going to do? If we're throwing people in prison, what good is it going to achieve? And it seems to me that this isn't going to, a law isn't going to stop people, not in this kind of case. Second, these laws do serious harm, right? Imprisonment is a massive harm. It's a very serious punishment. I think a lot of people in our society get very complacent about this kind of thing. They get very complacent about prison. And in fact, it's worse because we actually pat ourselves on the back about it. People say, oh, well, we're so humane these days. We don't flog people, we don't cut off their hands. I actually think, why not? Why don't we bring back those kinds of punishments and send less people to prison? And I totally disagree with the idea that, for instance, 5 years in prison is somehow less cruel or more humane than getting your hand chopped off. I'd rather have my hand chopped off. The difference between prison and corporal punishment is you don't see the damage that prison does, because prison mutilates the mind. But don't you dare try to sell me this bullshit about it being more humane. We're more humane because we lock people in prison. It just isn't. And I would say let's have less prison and more of these, corporal punishments. That seems like a more humane way to go to me. But okay, whatever. This is totally off track. My point here is that there's real harm done by these laws, because we're taking people who've done nothing wrong and subjecting them to horrible punishments. And of course, even if we don't catch them, they still be living in fear of horrible punishments. So, there's a lot of harm here. Okay, so even if you really disagree with incest and think it should be stamped out, you have to ask, is criminalising it really the way to go? There are ways of discouraging things that don't involve imprisonment, that don't involve criminalising people. And I'd say the same about many other things. I don't like heroin. It seems pretty obvious to me that it would be better if nobody took heroin. But criminalising it, it simply doesn't work. That does more harm than good. The answer to every problem is not necessarily to throw people in jail. Third, there's a simple issue of respecting other people, respecting other people's choices. You have to treat others as you would like to be treated. Putting everybody on the planet that has, pretty much everyone on the planet has sexual tastes that will be considered deviant by one group or another. If you don't get up to anything deviant, you're probably pretty boring in the bedroom. So, you should just try to be more accepting. You shouldn't demonise or criminalise people because they engage in weird activities. Finally, and for me most importantly, the law should uphold people's rights to their own bodies, the basic right of bodily autonomy, which includes the right of sexual autonomy, the right to choose who to have sex with. Incest laws infantilise people. A consenting adult can't choose to have sex with another consenting adult. If everybody's consenting, it's simply none of your business who's having sex with who. And it's certainly none of the law's business. So I should note, by the way, that there are two arguments here. The basic claim that I've argued for is that incest should be legalised. But I also add, if you look at the points I've raised, I think you'll see that there's nothing morally wrong with incest. Not only should it be legally permissible, it shouldn't receive any social condemnation at all. If you want to go and bang your sister, and she wants to bang you, go ahead. I don't think there are any good reasons to consider this a moral problem in any respect. But what I do want to emphasise is that even if you think that incest is morally wrong, this doesn't necessarily mean it should be illegal. There are all sorts of morally problematic activities we allow people to do. My own feeling is that the real objection to incest comes down to disgust. I think that's what's really going on. And it's the same with homosexuality. The real fundamental motivation for persecuting gays was that people thought, ew, that's gross. That's gross, so I'm going to ruin your life and throw you in prison. And then people had to come up with all sorts of ad hoc bullshit reasons to justify this persecution. It's exactly the same with incest. All of the attempted justifications for laws against incest are extremely weak. And they're obviously weak, right? The arguments in favour of incest laws are just obviously bullshit. All of the arguments we've seen today are obviously bullshit. And I did try to look for the best ones, I'm not just trying to straw man the opponent here.